Can I torch them off? Men Turasóireachta an AGM, Geranach.
Oh, right, okay.
Agus sin bhfuil agam. He should job like on the AGM.
Yeah.
You make well. Well, okay, can't you? Okay, this is the AGM. Last minutes, just the last minutes.
Sorry, I'm lying.
Because in 1994 we wanted to publish something as a tribute to Deirdre. We didn't get the money, but I know they were still there. Yeah, sure. Well, she can't possibly cover all of the one. No. Gliasáin, who is now in the branch of Logainmneacha, the Placenames branch of Dublin, to tell us about the Placenames of Inishowen, County Donegal. Do you wish me to? Any mischief stories? No.
No, I think that's all right.
Lovely.
Thanks very much, Kate. So I'm going to talk to you about place names in Inishowen and County Donegal today. So we're working on Donegal, townland names in Donegal, basically in the place names branch at the moment. Just to let you know, we moved into a different department, so I managed to just copy in the name of our new department at the top here. So we're now in and Roinn further to you. It's public, it's Gaeltacht, it's the Department of Rural and Community Development and the Gaeltacht. You might see Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and Media at the bottom of the page, but please ignore that for the duration of the lecture. So as I said, we're working on place names in Donegal at the moment, and we've been focusing on the Inishowen area. What I'm going to be talking about in the talk today is mostly based on archival research that we've carried out over the last few years, as well as some field work that was carried out back in the 20th century. So we'll be doing some field work on the ground there hopefully in the next few years. But this, the information in this talk is mostly based on archival research that we've been doing. And what I'm going to be talking about here today in terms of place names in Inishowen, it's by no means the full picture, so we're still working away at this. So I'm just going to take you through a few things that have come up in the research and mention a few interesting names, hopefully. So first of all, many of you will be familiar with the place names branch and the role the place names branch has, but I should probably just mention that quickly before we go on. So the place names branch undertakes research into the place names of Ireland to provide authoritative Irish language versions of those place names for official and public use. So we research place names and recommend authoritative Irish language forms of the place names, and then those Irish versions are published in draft place names orders, which are then examined by the Place Names Committee and also go through a period of public consultation, and then after that they will be signed into law by the Minister of State. So the Place Names Committee came into place in place of the Place Names Commission, which was there previously. So there's been a number of place names orders have been published, signed into law for different counties. So we have place names orders for counties Cork, Dublin, Tipperary, Louth, Limerick, Waterford, Kilkenny, Offaly, and Monaghan. So the Irish versions of place names and those place names orders have official legal status for official and legal use. There's also place names orders for the Gaeltacht area. So there's two two place names orders for Gaeltacht areas, one focusing on the administrative names, and then there's one which focuses on minor names, a certain amount of minor names which are on the Ordnance Survey maps. Then there's also place names orders for centres of populations and districts. So that's basically covering towns and that kind of thing. So there's a number of draft place names orders that are ready for the Place Names Committee to scrutinise at the moment. Some of them are going through the Place Names Committee at the moment. So we have draft orders for Sligo, Laois, Wexford, Carlow, Mayo, Longford, Galway and Leitrim. So these are ones that have to be, the research has been carried out, but it's just waiting to go through the final process. So, as you know, today we're going to be talking about Inishowen. So we're currently focusing on the administrative names in Donegal. We're focusing on other areas as well, such as Meath and Cavan, but it's mostly on Donegal that I'm working. And as I mentioned, there is place names orders published for the Gaeltacht areas. So of course, the Donegal Gaeltacht areas are covered in that as well. So for this research, we're focusing on the administrative names that are outside the Gaeltacht, so are not in official Irish-speaking areas. So I'm sure most of you will be familiar with Inishowen. It's in northeast Donegal. It contains the most northerly part of the country, the island, and it's divided into two baronies, so the barony of Inishowen West and the barony of Inishowen East. So when we're carrying out our research, we're focusing on the administrative areas within these baronies, the administrative place names within these baronies. So the sort of categories of administrative names that we're looking at include civil parishes. So in Inishowen East, we've got 6 civil parishes, 164 townlands, 8 towns and 10 population centres. And in Inishowen West, we have 7 civil parishes, 118 townlands, 5 towns and 6 population centres. So the towns and population centres are already covered by place names, centres of populations and districts order. So those names already have sort of official legal status. So when I'm researching, I'm basically mostly looking at the civil parishes and the townlands. Now as we're doing this research, we also collect minor names that come up in the various different sources. And in Inishowen as a whole, we've identified over 1,000 minor names to date. So it's a lot of names, and they're not really being covered in the research that we're doing. They're not part of the remit. We're just marking them down for, with the hope that maybe they will be researched at a future date. And also, it's useful to have those names when you're researching the townland names, because they can give you an insight into various different things. So all these administrative names can be found on the Logainmneacha website, and the way, so names are displayed a slightly different way if they're being published in a place names order and as against to when they haven't. So for example, if we look at the town of Mobile, the Irish version of that Bulletin is a validated name, so that means it's published in the place names order, it has that official legal status. The parish of Mobile, so there's two parishes, Mobile Upper and Mobile Lower, they're civil parishes. The Irish versions of the Irish names for those parishes are just recommendations at this moment in time, because they haven't gone through the Place Names Committee and public consultation and that kind of thing. So this appears differently again on the Logainmneacha website, so you'd see with towns or population centres, you'd see a validated name, or Gliasáin in Irish, and for the ones that aren't, in Donegal, the civil parishes and townlands names, you'd see non-validated name where there's an Irish name recommended, or Gliasáin. So you'll notice there as well that there's a difference in the Irish name for Mobile for the town and also for the civil parish. The name Bulletin is fairly well attested in Irish, and it's very clear that that's the name that was used by local Irish speakers. And one of my predecessors in the Place Names branch, Arts Owen Fall, would have interviewed a native speaker, or sort of a lapsed native speaker, in the Uras area of Inishowen in the 1960s, and he recorded this version of the name from him. So during the interview, he asked him, I went to Ealaíon, were you ever in Scotland? And he says, Charrow, I never was. And then he says, Bhí me nide, bhí me litir canan, agus bhí me an muna phobal. So then Art says, Muna phobal cinát sin ríis is there sé móvil. Anishin and Shan and Gaelic, is that the old Irish name? Yeah, it's níl sé custom leis an Airla. So he recognises that it's different to the Irish name, which is obviously as rooted in Irish and much older probably than the Irish name of the town. Now it appears that Bunnaphobal only refers to the town itself, doesn't refer to the parish. So for that reason, so far we've recommended Movilla as the Irish version of the name of the parish. Bunnaphobal was also mentioned, so it's also mentioned in the Ordnance Survey letter. So O'Donovan says there, a neat village has sprung up of late years at the mouth of this little river called by the natives Bunnaphobal, but by the inhabitants of Derry and by strangers Moville. So it's important, as I mentioned there was native speakers in parts of Inishowen until quite late, particularly in the Uras area, in sort of the northwestern part of Inishowen. It's important, of course, when you're researching place names in any area to get as good an understanding as you can of the dialect in which those names were created. So again, O'Donovan, when he was in this area, he remarked about how Irish speaking that area was. So he said, Clonmany, I think he was coming into this area after being in Derry, so he said, Clonmany was the most Irish parish I have yet visited. The men only who go to markets and fairs speak a little English. The women and children speak Irish only. This arises from their distance from the villages and towns, and from their being completely environed by mountains, which form a gigantic barrier between them and the more civilised but less civil inhabitants of the lower country. I never heard Irish better spoken nor experienced more natural civility and innocence than in that very secluded and wild parish. So high praise from John O'Donovan there for the people of Clonmany. It's interesting to know as well, I just noticed this in the last couple of weeks, in the statistical survey or parochial survey of Ireland, which was done, well, the first volume was printed in 1814. It was remarked there that in this area in Clonmany, again, there was a number of older men in the area at that stage who could read and write Irish, and also that there was a number of manuscripts in the area, so old manuscript poems of Fionn McCool and fragments of Oisin's poems, and also an Irish manuscript on theological subjects. So it's interesting to note that that sort of tradition was still alive to some extent at that point at a fairly late stage. So then, in terms of the actual dialect that was spoken in this area, we're lucky enough that we have a couple of sources from the 20th century that were that gives research of some of the remaining last speakers that were in that area. So there's an article by Emrys Evans in Loughlin on the dialect of Uras, which is based on his thesis, the Gaelic dialect of Uras, in Inishowen, County Donegal, which was done here in Queens, as far as I know. Then there's also a couple of Dugan recordings from Inishowen, and then there's one point in the Linguistic Atlas and Survey which relates to Inishowen. Then also, as I mentioned, we have some of my predecessors interviewed a native speaker in the area as well. So it's very useful to be able to use these sources when you're considering elements and features of the name, trying to figure out what the original Irish versions of them are. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of names where this kind of knowledge of dialect and the available research on the dialect is useful in ascertaining what the original Irish name of the version of the name was. So one interesting name was this Meaden Moor on Meaden Moor. So looking at the name, it seemed fairly clear what the first element was, but it's not something that comes up in dictionaries, and it's not something that comes up in other administrative names around the country. So I was interested to see where this came from, but I couldn't really find an exact equivalent of it in any of the main dictionaries. But when I looked in the Linguistic Atlas and Survey of Irish Dialects, so first of all, the local pronunciation given in English was Mead More. But looking at point 68 in the Linguistic Atlas and Survey of Irish Dialects, which is from the Irish area, question number 621, which was meadow or pasture. There's a number of interesting things mentioned there. So you have Covrin midden, a meadow, fair midden, a meadow grass, midden fiestally or midden fiestally, a rushy meadow, and fiestalaha instant middenaha, forked rushes in the meadows. So this shows us fairly clearly that this word midden was a word used in the local dialect to describe a meadow, and it's probably just a variant form of Meadún, which means meadow, and is found in other parts of Donegal as well. There's also a couple of minor names in Inishowen, Meadenmore and Meadenbeg as well, so it does come up in the minor names, but this is the only example in the townland names. Another good example is this Ballynahoan. So it's fairly clear what this name is, fairly clear what the origin is. I'm not sure how well you can see the historical references, but in general, if there's no evidence to suggest otherwise when you're giving the Irish version, recommending an Irish version for a name like this, you would recommend the standardised form, so Ballynahoan, unless there's good reason to do otherwise. And there's a couple of interesting things to note here. So first of all, in the historical sources, there's a reference from a local informant called Neil O'Barra, who gives the local form of it as Ballynahouna, which would suggest that it's the non-standardised version, standard genitive form of Owen. So that on its own would be enough, I would say, to recommend Ballynahouna rather than Ballynahoun. But supporting that then, if we look at Emrys Evans' thesis on the dialect of the area, you can see under the index under Owen, he gives Nahona as the genitive form of Owen. So for that reason, the Irish version that we've recommended for this townland is Ballynahouna Shachas instead of Ballynahoun. So another name where the dialect kind of was useful in recommending a form was this, I'm not actually sure how this is pronounced in English, but it's Kinyaya in Irish. If you didn't have the local pronunciation in Irish, you'd probably be more inclined to recommend Kinya, which would be a more standard version. Fia was the word that was used for rushes in Inishowen, and that's given in by Emrys Evans again. But with that local form, Kinya, you'd really have to recommend Kinya rather than the more standardised version, Kinya. It's very, very useful to have this kind of information on the dialect when you're doing this research and to figure out what the original elements are in the names. One thing, just looking at the recordings with native speakers and the versions of the names that are given by native speakers and the sort of interpretations that they have of the names. I just wanted to say a little bit about translations and mistranslations in Irish place names. Now, we don't really have, there's not that many examples of this in Inishowen, but when you hear native speakers talking about the names and sort of interpreting the names to the interviewer, you kind of get an idea of where sometimes these interpretations come from. So I think often there's kind of this understanding maybe that English speakers come in and sort of cack-handedly translate Irish names. But I think a lot of the time translated versions of names kind of probably come from Irish speakers where there's an element in the name that they don't understand anymore. It's in a sort of an archaic word or something like that, and they sort of mistranslate it on that basis. I think there's probably a bit of both things going on. But just, these are some examples of translations and mistranslations from different places around the country. So we have, for example, Logainmneacha in County Leitrim, which is translated, which is has a local variant form of Toothfield, which we found in the school's folklore collection, which you'll also see it on the likes of Daft, RIP, and those kind of things. So it's a version of the name that is in use locally. Toothfield is fairly accurate translation. You could say field is maybe a bit too broad for townie, but fairly accurate translation of the name. Then we have, for example, Gaeltachta, which is known locally as Palmfield in Roscommon, which is sort of a slight mistranslation of Ure. And then we have Clocacacha in Limerick, which has the sanitised version of Sugar Hill in English. And then there's one in Kildare as well, so there's a townland called Kingsbog, or Common, in Kildare, and the Kingsbog part is basically a mistranslation of Meán and Ree, where it's Friach rather than Ree, but they sound the same in the genitive form. So, as I said, there aren't really very many examples of these kind of names in Inishowen, but listening to native speakers talk about the names with interviewers, you can kind of see sometimes where these translations, you can kind of see these sort of translations happening in the head of an Irish speaker in the moment. So one example of this is Gliasáin. So Gliasáin is a very well attested name. It's the second element in it, Mania, is it's fairly clear. It's probably a personal name, but it's not a name that would have been in continuous use. So coming into the 20th century, it's not something that a native speaker would really recognise or know what it is. So when asked about this name, the interviewee says in English, some would tell you it's the milk meadow, which is based on the understanding that it's Gliasáin, Banya with the eclipsis before it. And others would say it's the monk's meadow, which is a fairly obvious kind of explanation of it. But you can see through that how sometimes these mistranslations can come about. Another name in Inishowen, Fegert, so we reckon that this is a combination of two elements. So Fiad that we saw earlier, which is rush or rushes, and the word Gert. But he gives a sort of interesting translation of this one, and I think this one is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but he says, Gert means salted, so it's the salted rushes, based on Gert, meaning salted or savoury. So when Art heard him say that, he says, no, he wasn't too happy with that explanation. Then going back to the example that I showed earlier of Meán Ree and Kingsbog, there's a townland in Inishowen called Doon-Riwach, which is fairly clearly represented in the historical forms of Doon-Riwach, or something along those lines. So it's fairly clear that it's Doon-Riwach instead of Dunree or something along those lines. But he said, I thought it was the Kingsfort Doon-Ree, but you see, but they say that it's the Heatherfort. So he had both interpretations, both of which weren't true to the original, but very understandable interpretations based on the modern pronunciation of the name. And then one example of an actual, probably translated form, is this Dutch rock, which is off from the coast of Meán, I think, and a local informant gave this, an English speaker, an informant that didn't speak Irish, gave it very clearly as Creducci. But it's the translated form that we find on the Ordnance Survey maps. So I want to say a little bit about the element ceathrú now. So it's one of the more common elements that we find in names in Inishowen. And of course, ceathrú is something that you find sort of in different parts of the country, all over the country, particularly on the sort of western seaboard. It's very, very common in Connacht. but it refers to a particular type of land unit, but depending on the area, it refers to a land unit of different sizes in different areas. In some areas it's a larger land unit which would have contained smaller ones, and in other areas it's the unit which eventually came to be a townland, and that's definitely the case here in Inishowen. So if you look at, for example, the civil survey, most of the units, land units that went on to become townlands in later days, they were described as quarterlands. And there's also an interesting description of the sort of the land holding system here in this area in the Inquisitions. So in the Inquisitions, for example, for County Monaghan, we've got it gives a very clear sort of breakdown of how the land holding system works, the various different levels of units that we use in County Monaghan. We don't have that in Donegal, but we get a few little snippets, a few little hints of the different hierarchy of land units. So in the Inquisitions for Donegal, it says in relation to Clonmany, again, Clonmany containing in the whole 5 ballybatas and a half, every ballybata consisting of 4 quarters. So these quarters are subdivisions of this larger unit called the ballybata, or Ballybeata, which is described as public hospitalers' land, an ancient land division equated to 480 acres of arable land. I'm not sure how accurate that is, but it's a larger land unit that was kind of broken into smaller units. So that's what Cahru seems to be in Inishowen, and it's generally the land units that became townlands in later days, and they were generally would have been quarterlands or Cahru. And because of that, in the names of the townlands, Cahru is a very common element, of course. It's probably the most common element that we come across in Inishowen. So you can find it with various different qualifying elements. So here, for example, we have ones that show size or shape. So we have on Cahru Bug, the small quarterland, and Cahru Ward, the big quarterland, and Cahru Queel, the narrow quarterland, and Cahru Trasna, the transverse quarterland. It's not really clear what that actually means. It's just something crossways in some way, shape or form. Then you can find it with different types of buildings, for example. So Cahru which the English version, Castle Quarter, is obviously English, but we find reflections of Irish versions in historical forms, such as this Castellon from 1608. So we have 2 examples of Cahru and we have Cahru Willen Freshen as well. One interesting thing that came up, there was 3 examples of this name, Cahru Vlach. So it wasn't really clear what the Vlach was originally, but it seems to be something to do with corn or the production of corn. So we've sort of tentatively translated these ones as the quarterland abounding in corn. Blech, you can find it in the Means dictionary, means a quantity or a portion of corn sent to a mill. Then he also has blach, a bag of corn for grinding, a kiln cast, a large quantity of anything as of meal, etc. And he also mentions it as, describes it as having power to grind. So it seems to be something to do with production of corn, milling, and that kind of thing. And it's interesting to know as well, when you look on the Ordnance Survey maps of these townlands, generally you can find a corn mill, which you can't really see on the picture there, but you can generally find a corn mill in those townlands as well, which sort of would support that. So a few other things then you will see with Cahru. So we have animals, of course, which is often seen in place names. Cahru Now, the quarterland of the oxen. Cahru Madi, quarterland of the dogs. Cahru Chleve, the quarterland of the mountain. And Cahru Rioch, the grey or street quarterland. Obviously they don't relate to animals. So it comes, it's quite frequent as an element in the anglicised forms of place names. So you'll often see Carol in the anglicised, the modern anglicised forms of the place names. But you'll often find Ceathrú in historical forms as well, where there's no reflection of it in the modern version of the name. And often you'll find it in just a single form that comes up in the historical versions of the names. So there's a number of examples of this. So one example is on Knock and Knock, where you find a reflection of Carol and Schnick in this version here from the 1661 map of Inishowen. Then on Anach or Anna, you find a fairly interesting version of this on the same map. It's interesting in the sense that it shows Catherine and Hannah, it shows that Anach was treated as a feminine noun in the name rather than a masculine noun, so Catherine and Hanny. On Strage, you find Catherine Strage in historical forms, and on Ghadihu, which we've sort of translated as the black place abounding in wide, so we reckon that the Gadi is probably a dative form of Gaeltacht, which would describe a place abounding in wide. It's not attested, but that's what it would seem to me. But we find a historical form that would suggest Catherú on the Gadi D as well. So it comes up again and again in these sort of historical forms where it's not in the modern English version of the name. Another very interesting thing that came up with this word Ceathrú, this is going back again to sort of interviews with local informants. It seems from what the local informants were saying that they sort of understood, or they sort of understood the word Ceathrú to be broadly similar to the word townland or town in English. So on the slide there we see the townland of Dunaff, or Dunau, as it was called in Irish. It was from this townland, the informant was from this townland, and the interviewer asked him, Caéis an Wallish Nish in the Willimadon. So what's the name of this townland that they're currently in? And he says, Ceathrú Seo Ceathrú. And the interviewer says, so he says, this is Ceathrú. The interviewer says, Caéis Ceathrú, what is Ceathrú? Dunau, Sinan and Ceathrú. Dunau is the name of the quarterland, or the townland probably is what he's thinking about. So it's interesting to note that in his head that was what the word Ceathrú meant at that time. It says the exact same thing about Tullach, Ceathrú Tullach, Sinan and Ceathrú. And in both of these cases, Ceathrú doesn't feature in the modern English form of the name, doesn't feature in any of the historical forms of it either. But it exists locally. It's probably broadly akin. You'll often hear people say in English, "Oh, what townland is this?" This is the townland of Ballymore or something like that. So it's probably not intrinsically part of the name, but it's kind of what he's describing the name as. We see some smaller elements then. So Ceathrú is the element that the land unit that became a townland. We see smaller land units coming up as well. So Treen, which is probably a subdivision of a large unit, probably the Ceathrú, but they're not necessarily always third parts of anything. But it comes up in historical sources as well. So for example, we have one Treen of the quarterland called Ballylain, so that's where it's been used in a description of a townland, not necessarily the name. But it does come up in the names as well. So for example, we have Gliasáin Treen Fossey, which probably is Treen Fossey. Very little evidence on that name. You have Treen on Tubber, the third part of the well. And Treen Ball, the White Third, and on Treen Third. These are all minor names, so we don't have very little evidence for them. But Treen does come up in minor names, and it does suggest that it reflects a smaller unit, whereas in other parts of the country you'll often see Treen in the names of townlands. And then what I think is even a smaller unit then is then Ballybow. Ballybow was described in the folklore of Gaeltacht as a portion of grassland or a tate. So it's a fairly small land unit, but you'll often find it mentioned in historical sources when they're describing land units. So for example, in the Registry of Deeds, we find a reference to the 4 ballyboes of October. So October is a townland, but described here as 4 ballyboes. Then there's actually a townland then, some of you may know it, called 11 ballyboes, which suggests this is a townland which contains 11 of these units. So that's interesting. So I just so there's a few other things I'm going to mention, and then I'm just going to throw out a few kind of names randomly that I've been researching that have been interesting. So one thing that comes up again and again in townland names when you're researching them is that, especially names that have that begin with Ballia, but in other ones as well, where you have a surname in the name, you'll often find that the surname is a surname that's often equated with an ecclesiastical family, because ecclesiastical roles were often hereditary, even though they probably shouldn't have been, but they were. And you can often find sort of professional families that were associated with different professions. The Chief Placenames Officer, Clór O'Crooley, has done a lot of work in this area, so he's noticed this a lot, but it comes up here in Donegal as well. So, for example, we have Ballycravshi, which is sort of situated in the Meán area. Of course, O'Cravshi is a fairly common name in this area, so you probably couldn't say for sure that it had an ecclesiastical connection here, but we have Rory O'Cravshi is mentioned in this parish in the calendar of papal letters as a priest in this area. So it's probably an ecclesiastical connection there. And then we have Ealaíon, and we can see Sean of Oifigeach, the canon of Derry, is mentioned in the calendar of papal letters. Not in this exact area, but in the kind of broad area as well. And in Gliasáin, Domadui, we could see Sean of mentioned as a priest in the Diocese of Derry, and he was also mentioned with Clonmany as well. So often when you see these surnames, quite often they're surnames that aren't connected with the area, and often then they're sort of surnames that have ecclesiastical connections with them. Ballycravshi may be a little bit different because it is quite a common surname in the area. So that's something that comes up fairly regularly. So I'm just going to point out a few sort of interesting names, there's not necessarily any real connection between any of these. But one that people may be familiar with this is Gliasáin Island. It's an island kind of out from the coast of Inishowen. It's fairly well attested, and it's attested in Irish from modern Irish speakers, being called Gliasáin, Ealaíon Gliasáin, and such. So there's a number of versions of it from speech. But looking at this Gliasáin, it was fairly clear to me what this is, what the structure of the name is, but what does this actually mean? So we have Glas and Age. What could that mean in the context of a name? But I think when you look at the island, it's very, very clear what the intention of the name is. It's quite a big rock jutting out with sort of high cliff faces around it, out of the sea, and there's sort of a green covering or a green mantle over the top of it, and it seems fairly likely that that's the origin of the name. So it's this word "agi," which means a raiment, a covering or a garment. So green covering or a green garment covering the island. So it's always worthwhile having a look at the place if you can, to sort of see what the name could mean. Another name that was a little bit puzzling was this one, Connacht Cunnago. So Cunnago is a townland area in and of itself, townland. So the sort of second part of the name is fairly clear. But the first element is Connacht, it was a little bit puzzling to us what this was. There's kind of a couple of possibilities. So it could be related to this word somehow, cunna, which was firewood. You could think that maybe there's some sort of substantive form of it, such as cunnach. So you find cunnach in the dictionary of the Irish language as a provider of firewood, but you could also imagine it as maybe being a place that there is firewood, a place from which firewood was collected. But another possibility then is this cunnach, which we find in the dictionary of the Irish language as wolf-like. So obviously you wouldn't think of wolf-like in terms of a place, but you could also extrapolate that probably to have another sort of substantive meaning as a place with wolves, a place abounding with wolves, a place that had a lot of wolves, or dogs, of course. So we were kind of puzzled about what this first element was, but then when you look at the place on the map, when you look at the townland, on the border with the next townland, there's a hill called Crookhamady, so it's in Crookhamady. So it's fairly clear then, you can be fairly certain that it's probably Connacht here, meaning place abounding in dogs, rather than the words related to firewood. This is another one that I think is quite well known, and people mention it a lot, is Carthage and Bunaghy. So people are always kind of wondering where this Carthage comes from and what the origin of this Carthage is, and the answer is I don't know really, but it's an interesting name because there's a few different names on the area going down through the years. So on the map on the left there, which is a map of Inishowen from 1661, it appears to equate to this. The modern townland appears to equate to this area here, which is two separate names. We have Carrick and Ballycarran. So they sort of equate roughly to the area of the modern townland. We find the recommended Irish form of the name is Bunaghy. You can find this on the 6-inch maps, Ordnance Survey 6-inch maps, and it's sort of a cluster settlements or cluster of houses called Bunaghy. And in a map from the 18th century then, which is in Prony, the whole unit, so the unit which today is called Carthage was known as Ballycarran, so that was the name given to that unit on that map. As far as I know, this Ballycarran isn't known locally, but Bunaghy is quite well known locally, so that's probably why that's been recommended as the Irish form of the name. If you look at the historical forms, and again I'm not sure how clear this is, there's a lot of different things kind of come up in the historical form. So we have Ballycarran is kind of the earliest version that we find. We see Craigcore and Carrickmacraig coming up as well. So there's a lot of different things in the historical forms. The first time we see Carthage is in the 18th century, which was so you can't see it, but it's mentioned on this map. So we have Carthage is mentioned on that. Bunaghy is also mentioned on it, but they're sort of cluster settlements. So there's sort of smaller settlements within the borders of the townland. But that's the first reference that I have found to Carthage anyway, in the sort of the middle of the 18th century. So then, where did Carthage come from? It's a fairly common thing that place names from other countries are transposed here from other countries, and it happens all over the place. So Carthage was a city in North Africa. There was the Carthaginian Empire. I think it was roughly where the city of Tunis is nowadays. So you can imagine that maybe someone set up a house there that was interested in classical history or whatever, and they just named the place Carthage after that. That's very possible. It's interesting though that we also find Cartagena as a field name in England. So I'm not sure how it's just pronounced Cartagena in English, but it's mentioned in the Dictionary of English Field Names. So a commemorative name, obviously we often find names commemorating different battles, wars that featured in the British Empire. So it's mentioned in the Dictionary of English Field Names as commemorative names alluding to operations at Cartagena, either in Spain during the War of Spanish Succession in 1717, or perhaps more likely in Colombia, where the British fought the English in 1741 at the Battle of Cartagena de Indias. It's also very interesting to note that there's a Cartagena in the Raphoe area as well. So that does come up in sort of minor names. It's a minor name, a house name in Raphoe. So where does this Carthage come from? I don't know, but it's probably one of those things, or a mixture of them all. So I'm going to say a little bit in a few moments about. I'm going to finish up by saying a little bit about Scots names. So there's a little bit of an influence of Scots language and Scots elements, or Ulster Scots, in the place names of Inishowen. Not as much as you will find sort of further down south in the Logain area, of course, but there is a bit of an influence of it. Before we get on to this, there's one name which sort of on the surface of it appears that it probably would come, looks like it would come from Scots, is this Mossy Glen. So on the surface of it looks very Scots, very English, and the modern version of the name. But when we look back at the historical forms, we can see that it's definitely something else. There's definitely something else going on, and it's definitely seems to be a name of Irish origin. So what we reckon this one is Mossnishina. So this is the long low hill of the glen. In the origin of history of Irish names and places, Joyce suggests that moss, a buttock or a ham or thigh is used to represent a long low hill in place names. And if we look at the contours in this hill in the area, it does seem to sort of fit that description of a long low hill. It's not that low, I suppose, but so that's a name that appears on the surface of it. It kind of looks like it might be Scots or Ulster Scots, but it's very definitely not. So I'll finish up by going into showing you a few elements and names that would reflect the sort of influence, Scots' influence on mostly minor names in the area. So we have Burn, which is a stream which comes up quite regularly. So we have Burnfoot, of course, which is a well-known town. It also comes up in actual river names. So we have like Crockwood Burn, Backburn, and Burnside, which is sort of a settlement. And we have the word Bray, which is a type of hill, which comes up in, again, minor names such as Vance's Bray and Mill Bray House. We have Now, which is Now or No, I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce that, which is a type of hillock or a knoll, which comes up in the name Brown Now. And we also sometimes see Scots or Scotch and Irish subdivisions of townlands. So, for example, the townland of Ballysharry, in sources such as on the Ordnance Survey maps and in things like the Tide of Poppin books, you'll often see things like these townlands broken down into Ballysharry Scotch, Ballysharry Irish. Same with Leafin, you can see Leafin Irish, Leafin Scotch. So a reflection of probably past settlement patterns there. And then finally, Calhain. So Calhain comes up quite a lot in Donegal. So there's no townlands. There's 8 townlands in Donegal by the name of Calhain. But there's no townlands in Inishowen by this name. But there's 5 microtoponyms or minor names in the area called Calhain. So it's when you drill down to the level of the minor names in Donegal, it's very, very common, and in the Raphoe area it's quite common as well. So Calheim refers to a poor or marshy farm, according to Pat, and it's also mentioned in the Placenames of Fife, so it does come up in Placenames in Scotland as well. Described in the Placenames of Fife as containing the Scots element cold and haim, so it's basically a cold home, and in some way it kind of describes a location that's somewhat inhospitable. That's what it seems to describe, or sort of a poor marshy farm. So on that note, I leave you. What I'd just like to say is that as we're working on townland names in Donegal and the administrative names, we're trying as best as we can to add descriptive notes to the names as well. So if you look, for example, if you look in this area and in the baronies of Rafo, north and south, you will see a number of articles with the entries on Logainmneacha which describe the name and sort of describe the thinking behind some of the recommended Irish forms. So if you ever have a chance, just go onto the site and have a browse through them. So you can see the article describing Ballycrawfshy there, Ballycrampsey. And on that note, I leave you. Thank you very much.
Willing to take questions?
Yeah, I'm willing to take questions.
What effect did the plantation have on the place names in Inishowen? People that were planted there when they moved. Considering it was given to Shaftesbury.
Yeah, well, it doesn't. You don't see the same effect of the same Scots impact that you would. So if you go down into the Logain area, there's lots of names that have Scots words, Scots elements, lots of names that are of Scots origin, Scots origin. See, there is obviously some examples of that in Inishowen. So you have Burnfoot and you have those names I mentioned, but there's not really that many of those names there. If you, in the Logain area, like if you look at field names, so for example, if you go onto the school's folklore collection, there's collections of field names. In the areas around the Fro, there's vast majority of the names in many cases are Scots origin. If you look at field names around Inishowen, they're generally of Irish language origin. They seem to be even sort of in the southern parts where there might have been some more. So I know it was granted to English by English settlers, but I think some Scots settlers did sort of move in at a later stage into the southern part of it. But you definitely don't see the same impact as you would sort of further south.
Yeah, I was just wondering, could you explain about the decision making when it comes to the recommended Irish version? So, for example, with Moville, why Bonafobal is given precedence over the more historical name Moville itself, which seems to come from Irish too.
Yeah. So we generally, when we're recommending an Irish version of the name, we try to figure out the version that was last used by the last kind of generations of Irish speakers in the area. So obviously you can't always ascertain that, and in cases where you can't, you use the Movilla. But in that case, it's very, very clear that that was the version. So we have it from an Irish speaker from the 20th century, and then going back to the Ordnance Survey letters, it's clear at that stage even that it was the Irish speakers that were using that, and it was, as O'Donovan said, it was more the outsiders that were calling Moville. So in general, where possible, we're trying to get that version that was used by the last Irish speakers. Obviously, that generates controversy in certain cases because people prefer maybe older, longer versions, more sort of poetic versions of the names that were in use at one stage, but weren't in use or seem not to have been used by the last generations of Irish speakers.
Can I ask you an awkward question about Moville? Did you go into it further? Because of course Movilla is here in UPNS, and St. Finian really seems to belong over here.
Okay.
But he's been attached to the Moville in Donegal as well, and I've always wondered how that happened. and not seen anyone trying to explain it.
Yeah, I haven't
Is it
tried
the place name attracted the saint who appears? What on earth is it that David Dunville said? Was he British? Was he Gaelic?
Yeah.
Was he? Finian is a bit of a mystery.
Yeah, I haven't dug into that, I'm afraid. Something I'll have to look into.
But,
I'll get back to it.
But
He's not from that area at
Who
all.
was there first?
Yeah.
Well, he's the one who possibly is the same as St Ninian. That there may be a misunderstanding in how the name was explained. And if he was British, he should have been Winiao. Then the word has become a fuck. Winiao, I suppose, if he was Welsh.
Yeah, well, I think these
So,
traditions often get...
what's he doing
Yeah.
with West Donegal?
Yeah, they often get confused, these traditions, I think so. But I honestly
Yes,
don't
no,
know.
I think
don't
so.
know.
I think Paddy O'Regan said it was the same as Finbar. The Cork saying Finbar was
Yeah.
really Finian.
Yeah,
There was a lot of confusion
Yeah.
there,
But Finian is the sort of master saint, as it were. Finbar is a version of Finian.
Yeah.
He's the big puzzle. He's the one that you have very early references for. But
No, just occasionally, if you know what that, obviously there's no contemporary sources for, well, 6th century, whatever, 5th century. Do any of the later Clumban, like the Irish knives from Derry or the Bahachon Killia, by Manus Donald, those mention that attribution. Was there a Clumban church in I know the most recent Bishop of Raphoe has been claiming it, but before he came to Belfast.
I don't, sorry, just
No,
Mel
Sorry,
Collins
sorry.
knows a great deal.
I don't.
But I have never gone into it in the detail I should. I don't know about the Manus O'Donnell life, but I would very much suspect that you're right, and it's trying
I
to.
don't know, it's only a question.
He's an important saint. He's sort of linked up with Columcilleach because he's an important saint, and then you're trying to attract, to the parish in Inishowen. You're trying to, get all that whatever it is, nuance, power, prestige, attract it there. But it's something, exactly how it happened, I would love to follow up, but one of the many things for which there has so far been no time.
I think he's really united with the large. I think that's a mistake. Mistaken. And then, with
The same thing can happen with St. Bridget, didn't it? She was kind of mistakenly connected with Loud.
Yeah.
It's not my area of
Because of
expertise.
the problem. Is that Paul?
Can I ask you about the name Urus?
Yeah.
Do you understand it to mean a peninsula in this case?
Yeah, I
so, is it? It looks like a fairly sort of bluntish peninsula, but I'm just curious because it seems to occur mainly as a qualifier, like Click Irish.
Yeah.
But was Urus ever used for a peninsula in the area?
I think it was used to refer. It's used to refer to the area there. Yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't really dug into what the etymology of Urus is.
But not so much as a feature sticking out in just of the area overall.
Yeah,
is that
sort of
right?
the area overall,
Rather than a prominent headland.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because you've got Dunree Head
Yeah,
and Dunat
which is
Head.
quite they're quite prominent,
Yeah.
and that's it. Yeah.
I think it's Ross, the peninsula, with an intensifier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Urus, yeah.
Ross,
Yeah.
just named the peninsula.
There's lots of examples of it, but they usually, like in Connemara and Mayo, but they're usually very recognisable peninsulas, and it's just like it's coastal, but it's a fairly blunt shape, I'm just wondering what it referred to, what the feature originally named was,
Yeah, I'm not sure the exact extent of Urus, like what
Yeah.
exactly it refers to.
The name Inishowen itself, the Inish is
Yeah.
an island.
Yeah.
I don't know any other example where it
Yeah.
means a peninsula. So was it because it was
Because
originally an
it's so-
island?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but because it was so cut off that
Yeah.
that it was so cut
The
off.
sea
that
level
probably
was higher.
Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure exactly, but it must have been.
Black
must-
Isle, from east of Scotland, is surely a peninsula too.
Isle, yeah.
I'm assuming it's
Yeah. Probably so cut off that it was might as well have been an island, you know. But
yeah.
I'm sure at one stage it probably was.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
As
was
you
much
go
more
to
plateau,
Meán and
wasn't it?
down to Dunaff is kind of like the end of the world.
Yeah.
Cut off from everything. So
Yeah.
The bottom of Gliasáin, there's a lot of land has been reclaimed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That was obviously a lot of sea
Yeah.
at one stage.
Sorry, could you go over two more for me there? The one on the island,
Or Gliasáin, yeah.
Eddie, something,
Last year.
Gliasáin,
Gliasáin.
and what's the anglicised version of it?
Last year.
Gliasáin.
And what would be the translation we've been given, do you think?
Well, I think a green mantle or green covering.
Is that never thought of stream?
I know what you're getting at, but I'm not sure that it would be really would suit
Yeah.
the location. I'm not sure if there's a stream.
I'm just wondering, it was, it's
I know Gliasáin.
Gliasáin
It is.
cover, yeah, it
it's-
sounds,
It is strange, and
Yeah.
it would be, if that is the case, then it would be quite an old name, like so a
Mm.
compound of two elements like that.
and the other one, Bonagee,
Yes.
I'm just thinking of another, Aki, or Akka field, Bonaki.
Don't think that wouldn't really fit with
Yeah, and-
the emphasis of the names of Bunagee.
Yeah.
Um,
And there's
Bun-
Gree
Bun-
Gree in it, Bonagee.
So Gree doesn't mean wind in this.
No,
So it's an inlet, and it would
Yeah.
that would suit the location of it. And Gree, when it means an inlet, is usually
But the
masculine.
genitive form doesn't come in there, you know, Gree.
With it's masculine in that case. Usually the
Yeah,
inlet.
yeah, I mean, yeah,
Bonagee.
see what you mean.
So there's another Bonagee. Just it's kind of it's now kind of a suburb of Logainmneacha, I think. And we do it obviously, but
Yeah.
it's that word is masculine usually. There is, I think, the Bonagee in Letterkenny, I think it's feminine in that, but it probably does refer to the inlet rather than the wind. Maybe it's just kind of been sort of extrapolated to the wind.
I mean, the word's almost obsolete. I think
Yeah.
Jerry Stockland recorded it in Acto.
Did he? Yeah.
Yeah, but I think in most areas it's like obsolete from the vocabulary and it's just remained in place names.
Yes, it'd be very easy to go to the pen and then
I'll have a paper on it in that.
very good.
Sometime.
Look forward to it.
The locals have put out Bonagee. They're determined it's the one.
I have one, yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm afraid it's the estuary to the inlet.
What was the last generation of Irish speakers? You know, where the majority of the population were Irish speaking?
Over the whole area, I'm not sure, but I'd say if we're talking about this sort of this Eris area, I'd say in the early 20th century, I'd say most people were Irish speakers there at that point. There is an article about it in the Donegal Annual. I'm not sure, I can't remember exactly who wrote it. That kind of goes through that. I think the last generations of it. But at the time of the Dugan recordings, which I think were the 1930s, they were like the speakers that were recorded there were quite strong, like strong Irish speakers. The man that Arthur Milfall would have interviewed would have been sort of a lapsed native speaker. He did speak quite well in Irish, just he was more natural in English. He would have had a tendency to go into English. He was kind of being pushed back into Irish all the time. But yeah, I would imagine in that area for sure, in the early 20th century, being very strongly Irish speaking.
There's a book called The Last of the Name.
Yeah.
And it's very good at, you know, it's identified a lot of the people who spoke Irish, you know, and recorded places and things, you know. I don't remember who the author was, but
Yeah.
Last of the Name.
Was it the Gliasáin?
The
I
Gliasáin.
think so, yeah, I think so.
I think the first name.
It's hard enough to come by, I think, that book.
Yeah, it's, I managed to get it from the Animal Library sale, you know. And
Yeah. Yeah, I was trying to get my hand on it myself, but I didn't succeed.
Any more questions?
should I just ask?
Oh, yes.
Sorry, I don't want to hog the question. Did you come up with any definitive interpretation of Ballyliffin? Like the L-I-F-I-F-A-N
No.
in the Gaeltachta?
No.
It's a bit puzzling.
We were talking about it earlier,
I
you
know.
mentioned Lavigna, the half ticket, whatever that
Half
is.
ticket.
It's hard to imagine what that might be really, but
There's a couple of different names on signs at the village.
yeah.
One of them is Levin,
Yeah.
the White Herb, which I don't
Oh,
think
I
is
don't see that.
very likely.
Yeah, I think like the Ballyliffin, in a way it's kind of unsatisfactory, but it's probably the only option in
The transliteration.
the transliteration, yeah. It's not ideal, but
Something like Levin in place of herbs or something. L-U-I-V-H-E-I-N, maybe.
maybe, yeah.
I think you do, you sure you do, what do you think, you get le for a side or half of mean, because there's a place up above Duchry, you know, almost up to Glenveigh, that's called Levine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I decided, but I don't know whether this is true or whether the New Zealanders accept, there was a place in New Zealand called Levin, and I thought they must have got that funny stress from somewhere, certainly not Maori. I wondered if that was a Donegal transplant, but that's
Well,
another of these rabbit holes I haven't followed.
I was searching for, this is research now, like putting a townland name into Google. It was one of the townlands around Raphoe, and there was a whole neighbourhood somewhere in New Zealand, Christchurch I think, where there was like a housing estate, and they're all just townlands in the Raphoe area. Some Donegal builders there.
No, I mean, again, I was never able to follow this up, but I spent some of my years 12 to 14 in New Zealand. And one of my classmates, she said her grandmother spoke Irish in the house. I mean, you know, to them, they knew she spoke Irish. She didn't teach it to them. But certainly there were plenty of people from,
Oh, for sure.
yeah, from Ulster, I suppose, and Scotland and New Zealand. Any more? Anyway, thank you very much. Anyone will ever work out the exact size of Ballygold from dividing that townland into 11.
No. It wouldn't be a life well spent.
Right, thank you everybody for coming. There will be another lecture, of course, in the autumn, in November sometime. So, we'll try and if